Magic. What is it? What is it for? How do I use it? And how can I stop it from destroying my army? Well, these are some of the common questions that I, Medieval Squirrel, your host for today, find on Reddit in the comment section where they're asking other people, how do I use this amazing thing that has never been in a Total War game before? Even several years after launch of the first Warhammer game, people are still struggling, and therefore I've decided to make this video to kind of help you all out. Now, magic falls into two main categories, and then into smaller categories, and then into laws, and then dissected up amongst magicians, and that makes it sound really confusing, right? Well, that's where you're wrong, because there are actually only a limited number of types of spell. Now, each individual spell will have its own uses and disadvantages and its own cost. Magic is not created equally after all. However, realistically, all you need to decide is, do you want to hurt your enemies or do you want to help your own troops? Do you need something to be offensive or do you need something to help you be defensive? A bit like Hogwarts, so we're going to start with defense. Now, just as a heads up, I won't be covering the laws of magic in exquisite detail. If anyone actually requests that, I might do that at a later date. But we are actually just focusing on spell types at the moment, so without further ado, let's begin. Alright, so we're going to start off with a nice easy one. Augments, otherwise known as buffs. You can increase stats and traits of your units by using this class of spell. So you can make units unbreakable, grant them frenzy, or in this particular case with flesh to stone, you can increase armor or in some other cases weapon damage and make them either killier or last longer in a fight. Now, this is a reasonably solid type of spell, but it is situational and they don't last forever. You won't be causing mass damage with this, but you could make your army last, pretty much a lot longer. In this particular case, we've taken Grail Guardians, an already tanky unit with the highest armor class in their roster, including their legendary lords, and buffed them up so that they are more armored than a War Mammoth. A whopping 180 armor is just completely broken, which means for the duration of this, they will take 0 damage. When pairing it up with the next type of spell, they won't lose any units either, and if they do, they'll just magically reappear. Right, and on to the next one. Regeneration, or more commonly referred to as healing spells. Now, it's just as it says on the tin, you give hit points back to damaged units, and let's be honest, they're best used on units with a high health pool. So, Stegodons, Dragons, Heroes and Lords, because otherwise it gets spread throughout the unit, and each individual model within that unit will also take some of the health back until they're full. Now, it must be noted that a small number of combatants can sometimes be brought back from the dead if the other combatants in that group are already at full health. The overwhelming amount of life energy, or in some cases death energy, will actually go into those units and bring units back from the dead. But this does not work on single entity units. If you lose a Stegodon or a hero, you will not get them back through magic. You'll either have to wait till the end of the battle and see if they reappear, which is unlikely, but sometimes possible, or you'll just have to re-recruit them. Now, you can see that we're using Invocation of Nehek on these Graveguard and on Manfred, and it's just bringing back health points. This battle was actually won without a single point of damage having been taken, technically, because all units were at full strength in terms of numbers and in terms of damage. Now, there is one other thing to look at. Each unit has a total amount of health that it can actually gain back in any given battle. You cannot go over that limit. It won't let you. It's a game mechanic to stop you cheesing everything and from stopping you from basically sending one lord in and just repeatedly healing them. You can also only heal for as long as you've got Winds of Magic, unless you've got things like Corpse Cards, which grant a passive regeneration around them. But anyway, that's how it works. On to the next one. And lastly, hiding, which is a little like a specialised augment. Now, if you take a look at the spell Skitterleap, you'll notice that it grants the traits Stalk and Unspottable, and they also grant movement to the castee of plus 24% whilst they're hidden. And as they're unspottable and they're granted Stalk, which makes things hidden in all terrain, pretty much they're unseeable and therefore unkillable, allowing you to put up flanks or ambushes without being concerned that the AI is going to see it. Now, there are units that this is not going to work for. I wouldn't bother casting it on weapons teams, for instance, because it doesn't work. Although they can hide, it doesn't really do anything for them. There's also no point casting it on things like Hellpit Abominations, because they can't hide anyway, and therefore they can't be unspottable. So, kind of very situational. It's not one that I personally use a lot, but each to their own, and it would set up advantageous situations like this where the enemy just gets pulled apart. Anyway, on to a technically third type of spell. Now, before we move on to true offensive spells, I want to talk about something that isn't defensive or offensive. It really comes down to how you use it. That is summoning, of course. So summoning allows you to create an extra unit or creature to fight for yourself in any which way you want. Now, they can be used to flank, shot up units, which is what I'm doing here, or if you really need to take out that piece of artillery, or, I don't know, cap a town with some zombos, that's what you can do. Now, I've used Transformation of Cadon here in this battle to use a Manticore to basically stop the enemy front line from hitting mine. I have no frontline or melee troops, only archers and cannons, which means that if we get to close combat, which is quite likely in this particular situation, I'm going to get killed, because all of my guys have only got a choddy little knife and we're up against proper professional men with spears and axes. Now, this is a bad thing, but the Manticore that I've summoned will go and rather nicely sit in the middle of the bunch, chodding them up. Now, this Manticore, much like any other summoned unit, will gradually lose health over time, both because it's getting attacked and also because the binding that keeps it in our world is starting to get weaker. It won't stay with the army after battle, and it can only be summoned a small number of times. So the actual number of times depends on both the level of the spellcaster, the type of the spellcaster, and the unit that's being summoned. You'll be able to summon far more zombies and skeletons than you ever will Manticores, just because of the difference in tier. Now, you also can't summon a unit if you've reached your unit cap. So if you hit 40 units, or if you're playing on smaller battle sizes, 20 units, then you won't be able to summon anything. So you need to stay underneath that cap. If you hit that cap and you can't summon a unit and you really, really need to, you'll either need to withdraw a unit or let a unit get beansed up to the point it either dies or routs. Neither of which is a favourable option, so kind of situational how you're going to use summoning, and it's not always the best idea. Anyway, as I've said before, on to offensive spells! And now, on to offensive spells. The damage dealers, your heavy hitters. If used correctly, they can turn a total defeat into a heroic victory. Starting with the support style offensive spell, the Hex. Now, a Hex is essentially a debuff. We've already talked about Augments. They give bonuses and buffs to your units. Well, the Hexes do exactly the opposite, but they do it for enemy units. So, using a Hex, you can reduce stats, block abilities, prevent movement, or cause fear and terror. Hexes on their own aren't very good. You need to couple them with something. So for instance, if you were going to use fear and terror, couple that with a rear charge, preferably with something monstrous and preferably with something that causes fear on its own. That way you could literally turn what was an enemy army into a full-scale rout. Now, as you can see, I'm using the Hex Net of Amontech to stop movement and basically pull apart this army of mammoths. Realistically, if allowed to charge all at once, they would break through the Phoenix Guard and scatter my archers, which are the only way I'm going to be able to deal with these mammoths. They are also quicker than all of the units apart from the guys on the chariots, and therefore, realistically, there's no way I would be able to beat them in a normal confrontation. Slowing the amount of enemies that are able to come to a front door and pulling them apart using the chariots are the only way we can beat this battle. And as you can see, it has turned from a defeat to a rather decisive victory. Bombardments offer high damage without being tied to a target. They bring a magical missile all the way down from the heavens to smack into an enemy position, which means that it can be dodged. So be careful with that because they're expensive. It also means that you kind of need to tie an enemy unit down. Best way to do that is to lock them down with infantry or to use a hex type spell such as Net of Amontok. There are abilities that can do this, but I wouldn't rely on them too heavily. Now, they don't cause a lot of damage per unit, but per character. So a big unit of 120 men will take damage on any one of those 120 men within the radius, but the damage will be per character in that unit not just to the unit itself, which means you may not get a lot of kills from this spell, but it will cause a lot of damage. I would advise not to use them against single entity targets because quite frankly it won't do a lot of damage. It will do a lot of damage against huge numbers of troops packed into tight formations, choke points, gatehouses, and other types of small combat areas where you can pin enemy troops, keep them there, and then bring down a comet or rain of fire on their heads will do absolute wonders. As you can see, I've targeted the top of the gatehouse and I've done quite a bit of damage to those skeletons, but not a lot of kills. That doesn't matter though because it makes it so much easier for our temple guard when they breach the walls. Explosion type spells are similar to bombardment spells in how they're used, however, instead of bombarding a position with fiery death from the sky, it kind of explodes out from a central point. I mean, you all know what an explosion does, just throws things everywhere, and in this particular case, it throws a lot of Skaven meat all over the floor. Now, these do huge amounts of damage and they do scatter enemy formations, but they are not very good against single entity units. So don't use them against lords and heroes, otherwise you will become a chump. Also, they are dodgeable. They do not stick to the unit you put it on normally. So be careful. You need to lock down those units exactly the same way as you would a bombardment. Those two spells are basically interchangeable, but this one will almost always do more damage. Now, we're using Deliverance of Hits 2, and as you can see, we're racking up the kills and throwing Skaven bits everywhere. I think at the end of this battle I caused 1,200 casualties with Croak alone, but there are spells for other factions. So for instance, the Foot of Gork for the Greenskins, not quite as effective because it's not a special legendary hero character, but it still causes mass damage. So keep your eyes peeled, these are probably going to become your bread and butter offensive spells. For anyone who has seen any of my Imperial Dominance campaign with Karl Franz, you will know that the Purple Son of Xeris, the Vortex spell that Ubel Billings wields, can have both disastrous consequences for myself as well as hilarious consequences against the enemy, or as is most often the case, it just sort of wanders off on its own like a tornado through a field but not really doing any damage, basically like Taz on steroids wandering off away from what it's actually meant to be doing. Now, Vortex spells are all like this. You plonk them down and they wander off in a random direction. You can't aim them at all, which means that you cannot use them the same way as you would a bombardment or explosion spell. Do not put this near mass groupings of your own troops. You are basically flipping a coin and 9 times out of 10 it turns up heads, you fail, and it will wander into your own army. That means the best way of using this particular type of spell is to get enemy all around a single entity unit. So for instance, using your Lord or units like Steam Tanks and Stegodons, then plonking the Vortex down right next to them and hoping for hell's sake that it wanders into the enemy instead of out into a field. Either way, it will damage the enemy and not yourself. Single entity units don't really take a lot of damage from Vortexes in the same way as it doesn't really take any damage from explosions or bombardments, mainly because all of these spells do damage per entity as opposed to per unit, and therefore they don't really take as much damage per second as would say a unit of handgunners, or in this particular instance, beastmen. Now, as I've said before, not all spells are created equally, and you need to pick the right lore and the right Vortex spell for the combat at hand. Now, the Purple Son of Xeris does do a lot of magical damage, but if a unit has buffs against magic damage, it's not going to do too well. However, Flamestorm, or the Fire or Bright Wizard, yes, that does a lot of damage all round because it does magical damage as well as fire damage, which means against low tier troops or anyone with weakness to fire, it's going to do a hell of a lot better, as is the case over here. It is also surprisingly cheaper, so realistically you use Fire Wizards against low tier troops and Amber Wizards against high tier troops. Breath spells can be used against large numbers of troops to kind of break up cohesion and throw units everywhere. They do a small amount of damage and basically they won't win you battles, but they will enable you to disrupt enemy formations. If used correctly and in cohesion with combined arms, they can be, as is here, absolutely devastating. If you time it correctly, you can use it to break up an enemy's charge and therefore enable yourself the charge bonus on a counter charge, which, when pulled off correctly, can be goddamn devastating. It can also be used to free up space around your heroes. Plague Priests use these the most because you can get a bound version as well as the normal version that they get, meaning you can fire it out in both directions and bring yourself a little bit of area to maneuver. Now, as I've already said, they do cause damage, but do not expect this type of spell to basically win you fights. That's not its purpose nor its role, and it will not do well. However, this next type of spell works similarly with a much higher damage. Wind spells travel in a straight line, damaging or knocking enemies as they go. Now, as long as you can be assured of multiple units being hit like bowling pins and basically all falling down, then this is the spell for you. Obviously, this is much more about a long straight line than the explosion or bombardment, so it has a slightly different use, but the goals are the same. Mass infantry or cavalry, trying to make sure that they have lower single entity health pools and not targeting lords, heroes or single entity units. This was not the spell for those. We'll get to those later. Realistically, this type of spell is best used in defense sieges or even offensive sieges. To be honest, any sort of close packed environment where you're sure to get them all lined up. I would not use this on any less than 3 units, otherwise you're wasting your magic. There is obviously something else that can be used, something cheaper that is going to be just as effective. Now, it must be noted that some wind spells are better at knocking units, some spells are better at absolutely destroying them. My personal favourite at the moment is Burning Head. That may well change in the future, but as you can see here, these 3 wizards have pretty much routed the enemy force by themselves. The spearmen are literally there just to pin them. Spearmen, and even Karl Franz in fairness, are just being used essentially as a net of Amontech. Right, so we've spoken at great length about magic that can literally transform the battlefield. Things like explosions and bombardments, hexes, regenerations and augments. All of those tasty spell types. Now we've got 2 left, and these ones are the ones that you want to use against big creatures, lords, heroes and the such. But there is a major difference between which one is the best and which one is less best. But they have got a price tag associated. Now we're going to start with the slightly more expensive and in my case, or in my opinion, slightly more useful. Now, direct damage dealing spells such as Spirit Leech can be cast provided you are within range. You do not require line of sight. It doesn't matter what's between the 2 of you, and to be honest, provided you're doing it on a single entity unit, it's going to work okay. I wouldn't bother casting it on actual normal unit groups because you're not going to do a lot of damage, but if you're casting it on a lord or a hero or, I don't know, some beast like a manticore, you're going to do a fair amount of damage. So the amount it costs and the amount of damage it does and the fact you don't have to be within stabbing distance, essentially, means you're fine. That's a good spell. I would recommend using it. It's good for sniping off lords or just weakening them up before you go into a duel. The other type does have a couple of teensy-weensy drawbacks. And by that I mean you need line of sight, and you are essentially using it like a cannon. But it takes winds of magic instead of ammunition, which is not a good trade-off if you ask me. So I'm going to use the spell Fireball. Most people will have seen it or had it used on them or used it themselves. Basically, it's a cheap spell. Most of them are cheap spells. They're kind of like entry-level spells for the most part. You fire something and there's a chance that it'll hit anything in its way. Whether that be your troops, their troops, the actual intended target, open ground, or terrain. So you need line of sight, and that means you need to spend points into things like a Pegasus, or a dragon, or a manticore, or something that flies. Or you need to position your wizard effectively so that it doesn't hit any of your troops in the way, and so that it doesn't get caught up. Which means you either have to start using it as if it's a rifleman or a cannon, or making sure that you're only using it within walls, so you can sit on the wall and fire down. And as we all know, that's not the most effective way to win a battle in a siege. So it does have some drawbacks. On the plus side, it's cheap. I would personally just save your magic and use something else, but that's my personal opinion. And you are free to do exactly whatever you want. If you think I'm wrong, let me know down in the comment section, because I'd love to know how you guys use magical missiles, because to be honest, for me, they seem like a bit of a waste of magic, and they're not something I ever really put a point into in my own magicians. Really hope that this video has been entertaining and informational for you, hopefully more informational than entertaining, although a little bit of both never really hurts. I mean, if you've not been entertained, you're probably not here now, so kind of need to 50-50 that. But I do want to make more videos just like this, so if you've got any questions you want answering, or anything that you think other people might want answering, anything you've personally seen in the Reddit section that hasn't got an answer that's quite good enough for you, then just drop it in a comment down below, or get in touch with me in my social media. I've got my Facebook and my Twitter link down below. You can get in touch with me there. I'll either make a video about it, or I will probably just get in touch with you through the means that you get in touch with me. Comments aren't just for those of you with questions though, so if you've enjoyed this video, I'd love to hear from you as well. Anything that you think needs to be tweaked, anything you need to be expanded on, let me know. It might end up being as a second video. Also, if you've enjoyed this, then please give it a like, really helps out, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and go and find me on Twitch if you want to join in with my live streams. And why not check out the videos on the screen, just as a little reminder. Not sure if you can see them, they're probably there. And remember, stay safe, go nuts for gaming. See you later, guys.